I'm Heather Reams. I'm back with you to introduce our next speaker. Another one. I get to, like I said, the rock stars. I'm so lucky to introduce so many of them. We have today Congressman Graves from Louisiana. Congressman is the top Republican on the House Select Committee on the climate crisis. Grateful to have him here because he is helping the Republican Party redefine the conversation, to engage on how we have a lot of energy development, but also in an environmentally sustainable way, that balance. And his leadership in this committee is I think, going to be eventually, we'll hold him a high standard, revolutionary in how we continue to move forward. So let me introduce you to Congressman Garret Graves. Tall order, right? Are you ready to wow us?
Thanks. Thank you. Thanks, Heather. Hey, great to join you all today. If you look around at the United States, you look at some of the press that's been reported about the United States and our role in greenhouse gas emissions and climate change, and you immediately come to the conclusion that the United States is this demon, that we're this awful beast that's out there that is having great contributions to climate change and not doing a damn thing about it. And I hate sometimes to kind of introduce inconvenient facts to the discussion, but I think if we're going to move forward on policy that makes sense, we've got to get an understanding of where we are right now. Number one, and I don't think you can say this enough, the United States has reduced emissions more than the next 12 emissions-reducing countries combined. The United States has reduced emissions more than the next 12 emissions-reducing countries combined. So we can step in and we can move forward and carry out these policies that squeeze the balloon in the United States and attempt to aggressively reduce emissions and attack climate change, when in reality, when you look at facts and you look at statistics, what that causes to happen is it causes us to become more dependent upon importing energy from other countries. And take 2012 as case in point. As there were efforts to try to constrict or restrict domestic energy production, what you saw was an increase in imports to the point to where 50% of the trade deficit for the United States, 50% of the entire trade deficit to the United States was attributable to us importing oil from other countries. How much sense does that make? And in fact, if you're doing this under the auspices of protecting the environment, think for just a minute about the fact that when you're importing energy, not just do you have a less safe exploration and production standard, not just do you have the threat of putting that energy in a ship or in a barge, which statistically, again, not my statistic, National Research Council, you have a greater threat of spilling the energy. You have a greater threat of spilling that oil and releasing it into the environment by putting it in a ship than if you do domestically produce it and put it in a pipeline. So the very objectives that we're working to achieve, improving environmental sustainability, reducing emissions, these strategies that have been carried out historically have resulted in the complete opposite. So until we can agree upon a basic set of facts moving forward, we're not going to be able to come together on appropriate policy that actually makes sense. Because you can look back historically, and if Waxman-Markey had been enacted, according to their projections, we would be releasing greater emissions today, not less. Waxman-Markey would have resulted in greater energy costs and greater emissions than what we've achieved voluntarily. And if we're truly going to attack this issue of climate and emissions reduction, we've got to stop looking at ourselves as the center of the world and the only thing that exists. We've got to stop looking myopically, stop looking at the United States in a vacuum, and instead realize that global climate change is a global issue, meaning that as we've reduced emissions in the United States, for every 1 ton of emissions we've reduced, China has increased emissions fourfold, 4 times what we've reduced, therefore more than offsetting all the reductions that we've been able to achieve in the United States. And I know that it's very easy to beat up on the president for withdrawal from Paris Accords, but I think that it was actually the right thing to do, and I want to explain why. It was the right thing to do to withdraw from an agreement that doesn't put the nation, doesn't put the world on a reductions emissions trajectory. Paris does not do that. When you look at the emissions of China, for example, I think they're going to approach 5 megatons of of emissions by 2030. They continue to increase emissions. India continues to increase emissions. Other countries are being labeled as developing countries that do not fit the criteria for what a true developing country is in today's times. These are inappropriate strategies, and I'll say it again. Under Paris Accords, as the United States has reduced emissions, China has increased their emissions. So I want to distinguish one thing. I believe we should have, it was appropriate to withdraw from Paris because we should not be a part of an agreement that condones emissions increases. However, I want to distinguish that from the actual emissions reductions targets and strategies of the United States. I don't think we should abandon those. I think we can continue to work toward a true global agreement that puts us on the right trajectory and doesn't result in simply leaking or offshoring of domestic energy production, of domestic manufacturing, of domestic economic activity, sending that to other countries like China, India, Brazil, Mexico, and others. I think that we can continue to have discussions about a true global agreement, a Paris version 2 perhaps, that truly results in the right trajectory, that doesn't result in the squeezing of the balloon in the center where the United States is and popping out on the sides where these, quote, developing nations are. I think we can do that, and we can continue to walk and chew gum with that second part, being the United States continuing on this trajectory of emissions reduction and leading the world in emissions reduction as we've been able to do over the past roughly 15 years. You know, the reality is, and further introducing facts into this discussion, the reality is that the United States spends more money than any other country in the world. And I believe on the science side, I believe that we may spend more money than every other country in the world. And on the technology side, we are the biggest spender. We have the largest investment in energy and efficiency and energy technology investments in research and development. We need to work to better recalibrate that strategy of where we're spending money on science and where we're spending money on research and development to ensure that we're moving in an applied direction, in a direction that will truly allow for commercial, truly allow for innovation and technologies that we can truly put out on the market. If we're going to truly make progress on this issue, as I started out by saying, truly make progress on this issue of climate change, we're not going to do it by continuing to discuss climate change as this 100,000-foot level topic, where climate change may mean one thing to you, something else to you, something else to you, and something very different to you over here, because it's such a ambiguous term. We're going to be better off taking that and splitting it up into digestible pieces. We're going to be better off by looking at what it is that we've done over the last 15 years to be the global leader in emissions reductions. And so one of the things that I think we need to be doing more of is recognizing that the first thing is adaptation or resiliency investments. And little known fact, once again, last year, I believe we made more progress on this issue than any other time in American history. And let me be clear, when I talk adaptation and resiliency investments, what I'm talking about is recognizing that the sea is rising, recognizing that temperatures are increasing, recognizing that that is going to continue, and recognizing that that's going to cause changes, because if you take the coastal counties, parishes, and boroughs around the United States, they comprise only 10% of the land area of this nation, yet over 40% of the population lives there, and that number is increasing. You can look back since 1980, we spent $1.7 trillion responding to disasters. $1.7 trillion, a truly unaffordable number, including hundreds of billions of dollars in just the last few years, with hurricanes Harvey, Irma, Maria, Michael, Florence, and what was it, Umberto, I believe, the last one in Texas. It's unaffordable to continue this of being responsive or reactive to all of these disasters. And so what we began doing last year is pivoting from a reactive strategy to a proactive strategy. We're making investments in the resilience of our communities and in the resilience of our ecosystem. Tens of billions of dollars in investment last year alone, greatest investment ever. Number two, recognizing, and as we enacted the Disaster Recovery and Reform Act last year, about a year ago, recognizing that we need to begin rebuilding after these disasters to a new resiliency standard, recognizing that the pre-disaster mitigation program through FEMA needs to be a more predictable, certain funding stream to help identify the vulnerabilities and address them well before we have a disaster exploit those vulnerabilities to where we don't have death and destruction when hurricanes and other disasters occur. Instead, we have resilient communities, resilient investments, a resilient economy, and a resilient ecosystem. So that's piece number one. There's no reason that should be a partisan fight. None. We can split up this issue of climate change into two digestible pieces. Number two, doesn't matter where you are ideologically. You can look at what the Trump administration has pushed, has prioritized over the last few years. Think about three things that they've really prioritized. One was tax reform, two was regulatory reform, and three was trade reform. Tax reform was done largely under the auspices of us needing to modernize our tax code in the United States to where we reflected current times, didn't have this tax code based upon '86 when mullets were in style. Instead, we reflect what's happened on the global scale in regard to tax policies and reform. It's inappropriate for the United States to have tax codes or tax rates in some cases that was triple that of Ireland and many Asian nations. And so we came in and we modernized the tax code, ensuring the competitiveness of the U.S. tax code compared to our global trade partners. Number two, regulatory. This administration has stepped in and they've looked at the regulatory environment that's out there, recognized that with new technology, with best business practices, and in some cases, outdated regulatory processes and objectives, we can reform those, we can update those to achieve the same regulatory outcome, but in a more efficient manner. And at one point, I don't know what the current statistic is, but I think they indicated that they rescinded 22 different regulations for every one new one issued. Again, not compromising regulatory objectives, finding more efficient ways of achieving them. Once again, helping to improve the competitiveness of the United States. Number three. Number three is the trade policies. And while this one's a little bit more prickly, ensuring that we have fair trade, not just free trade, but fair trade with our trading partners. Now, when you look at what we've done in the United States to reduce emissions, the second piece of after the adaptation and resiliency piece, the second piece that I think is a definable, digestible piece is looking at innovation, looking at conservation, and looking at energy efficiency. If we can reduce the cost of how much it costs to heat and cool your home, how much it costs to manufacture a widget in the United States, that's complementary to this tax regulatory and this trade agenda that we've been pushing. It shouldn't be partisan. It's all about improving the efficiency of manufacturing, improving the efficiency of energy utilization in the United States. And oh, by the way, it reduces emissions. Look, for example, at the light bulb standard. Look at the incredible innovation and energy efficiency that's occurred. And yes, I have heartburn about what the administration recently announced. And while I'm on that track, I'll also make note that I have heartburn about rescinding the methane rule, which I did not agree with. I didn't agree with that rule. But also, I think we should have replaced it with something instead of just coming in and rescinding. We need to make sure that U.S. energy is competitive and globally, not just from a cost perspective, but also from an environmental profile perspective. So those are two things, the adaptation, the resiliency, investments in energy conservation and efficiency, where we can help to improve the competitiveness of the United States. Because what happens if we come out there and we just start saying, hey, we're going to do Green New Deal or some of these other very transformative or revolutionary or, let's be honest, sort of obstructive policies. What's going to happen is similar to what we saw happen back in 2012, where we are importing energy. What's going to end up happening is what we've seen happen virtually every year as we've tightened and increase the cost of doing business in the United States, stuff is offshoring. And that's why, one of the reasons why China's emissions are skyrocketing the way it has. Because if you come in too aggressive in the United States and there's not parity with what's happening on the globe, all you do is send these manufacturing and other activities to other countries. Right now, we're having a hearing on cement and industrial emissions in the United States. And we're talking about how, right now, you're seeing emissions being offshored or leakage, as it's referred to, where you squeeze the balloon too much in the United States and it ends up sending these activities in other countries that have greater emissions per kilowatt hour. Not to mention the transportation emissions that are associated with it and the fact that most of these countries have lower environmental standards than the United States. So look, I started out this by just saying that I don't think this has to be divisive, and I think we truly can make progress. But the first thing we've got to do is we've got to agree on a common set of facts. We've got to back the emotion out of this issue. And yes, I'm from the state of Louisiana. We've lost 2,000 square miles of our coast, 2,000 square miles. If that were the state of Rhode Island, we'd have 49 states today. This is a big deal for me. It is emotional for me because this is where I live. It's where my family's from. It's where the people I represent reside. But if we're going to go down this emotional path, it's going to end up yielding worse outcomes, worse results than if we're thoughtful, agree upon facts, and build upon the successes where the United States has led the world. And that includes being very thoughtful about the role and capacity of renewable energies. Yes, fully support them, and we need to deploy them where they make sense. But as we all know, wind and solar or intermittent power, we don't have the energy storage technology to the degree that we need to fully replace, which means that gas in many cases is a complementary fuel source, as is nuclear power. We've got to make sure that we look at the strategies that have resulted in us reducing emissions, and that largely has been attributable to us deploying natural gas on a broader scale. And we've got to look at what states like California that have gone too aggressive and have had to increase their imports upon Saudi Arabian oil, or of course the story up in the Northeast that everybody likes to talk about, where they obstructed natural gas pipelines and didn't have the capacity to heat homes in the winter, therefore becoming dependent upon home heating oil, of course a worse emissions profile, and importing gas from Vladimir Putin, which I don't even need to get into all the reasons, but I'll make note of one. According to a study that just came out this week, U.S. natural gas has a 40% lower emissions profile, 40% lower than Russian gas. We've got to be thoughtful and deliberate about the strategies. Otherwise, we are going to result, our policies are going to result in undermining the very objective or outcome that we're trying to pursue. So with that, thank you all very much. Appreciate the opportunity to be here.